Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, Principles and Policies of Low and Moderate Income Solar. This webinar is presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, as part of the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar in Your Community Challenge. My name is Diana Chase. I'm a program associate here at CESA, and I will be moderating this webinar. In just a moment, I'll pass it over to our presenter for this webinar, Warren Leon, who is CESA's Executive Director. But first, I would like to go over some background information. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 8 individual presentations. This presentation focuses on the opportunities and challenges of low and moderate income solar. You can see the titles of our upcoming presentation segments on your screen. To watch webinar recordings or to sign up for the next session of webinar presentations, you can visit our web address, which is there on the screen. These webinars are free and available to the public. They are particularly geared toward participants in the Solar in Your Community Challenge. For those of you participating in the Solar in Your Community Challenge, I wanted to let you know about an important resource we're offering, virtual office hours. All of our instructors for this webinar series will be available for one-on-one consultations. To learn more about this and to schedule a consultation, please email me, Diana Chase, at the email address you see on your screen. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. He oversees the organization's day-to-day operations and leads strategy development. Prior to working for CESA, Warren was Director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust, Executive Director of the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, and Deputy Director for Programs at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Warren will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then he'll take questions from the audience. Warren?
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce the topic of low and moderate income solar by talking about opportunities and challenges. And the learning objectives for this particular presentation are threefold. First, to help you understand the importance of using solar to benefit low and moderate income residents and communities. Second, to help you understand the potential for solar to actually provide those sorts of benefits. And finally, to talk about the quite significant challenges that can make it difficult to adopt solar by low and moderate income residents and communities. So let's turn to the first of those 3 topics on that screen by looking at why is it important to use solar for low and moderate income residents and communities. The overarching reason is that in our society as a whole, inequality is a serious problem, and many people are concerned about this and would like to see ways in which we help LMI residents in our society improve their economic status so there's less inequality. Solar should be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. If solar is implemented in ways that the only people who can benefit from it are those on the upper half of the income scale, solar will be exacerbating inequality rather than helping to overcome it. And for LMI residents, dealing specifically with their electricity costs is especially important because if you look at the chart on the right side of the screen, for those folks who are in the bottom 5th of the income scale, they spend nearly 10% of their income on just electricity. That doesn't even include gasoline for their cars or energy sources like natural gas or home heating oil or wood for heating, 10% on just electricity. As you can see, that's much more than those folks who have higher incomes. And these are folks whose financial situation can be precarious. And if they are in a situation where electricity costs spike because of rises in electricity or some other factor, they could be put at a significant disadvantage. Well, solar can help them address their electricity costs. That's another reason to try to use it to benefit LMI residents. But on top of that, in addition to the reasons for doing LMI solar to benefit LMI households and communities, there's also a reason that has to do with the future of the solar industry. If there's a perception that solar disproportionately benefits the well-to-do, that could reduce public support for solar and make future prospects for the solar industry less rosy. Well, what's the opportunity for actually doing something about LMI solar? The opportunity is significant, and it's much greater now than it was just a few years ago. And the primary reason for that is that solar costs have fallen dramatically, and that makes solar quite cost-effective in many locations across the country. Solar can save consumers money, helping them address those high electricity bills. On top of that, there are already existing many housing programs and poverty programs that are established by the federal government, by state governments, by municipalities, by utilities to help LMI residents. To the extent that solar can reduce the expenditures of those programs on energy costs, it leaves more money for other ways to help the intended audience. There are a lot of solar policies that have been adopted out there by states, municipalities, and the federal government. In most cases, those solar policies were not designed with the LMI audience specifically in mind. They were more general policies, but those policies can now be tweaked and modified in ways that make them serve the LMI audience well. So all of those are reasons in which there's an opportunity to help LMI residents with their electricity bills. But there are also two other opportunities for serving the LMI audience, and one of them has to do with focusing on those organizations that serve low-income populations. Organizations like food banks and community health centers and homeless shelters. Those organizations have their own electricity costs and their own electricity operating costs. And if solar can be used to reduce those costs, it leaves those organizations with more money for carrying out their missions and serving the LMI audience. And on top of that, the solar industry has been growing rapidly, creating jobs. The solar industry can be a source of good jobs for LMI residents. So that's the opportunity, but there's actually some significant challenges with trying to take advantage of this opportunity. And the first set of challenges have to do with structural barriers, things inherent in the nature of the LMI population and the nature of the LMI economic condition. The first one of these is compared to folks in the middle class and upper income groups, there are lower home ownership rates among LMI households. There's a very high percentage of renters. And it's much harder for renters to take advantage of solar than those folks who own their own house, control their roofs, and are able to make their own personal decisions about installing PV on those roofs. And then on top of that, among that subset of the LMI population that does consist of homeowners, they're more likely to have problematic roofs than those who have greater incomes. The reason for that is the LMI population tends to live in older housing stock. They're more likely to be in a situation where the roof requires repair, or the shingles or whatever the other roof covering has been on the house for a long time, and you can't just put PV on it without dealing with the roof condition first. On top of that, to the extent that going solar requires making an upfront payment to buy solar panels or to put down a down payment or to make an initial payment into a community solar project, the LMI population is less likely to have enough money in the bank to make that initial upfront payment. That means they require financing to get involved in solar, but they have more difficulty accessing financing than those who are more well-to-do. And that's because they're more likely to have low credit scores or no credit scores. They're also disadvantaged by the way our solar policies have been set up. One of the main ways in which in this country we have made it possible for people to adopt and install solar is through federal and state tax credits. Well, LMI households may not pay enough taxes to be able to benefit from those tax credits. That puts them at a disadvantage. And finally, there's an issue having to do with the way the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development structures housing assistance that many in the LMI population take advantage of. That housing assistance requires recipients to spend 30% of their income on a combination of rent and utilities in order to get the housing assistance. Well, if their utility bills go down because they're taking advantage of solar, in some cases it means that their rent ends up just going up to compensate for that. So those are all structural barriers. There's also the issue that needs to be considered that LMI residents may be hesitant to go solar. One big reason for that is this is a population that has some significant economic challenges. There are family issues to deal with. They just may not have the time or energy to engage in long considerations about pluses and minuses of different solar options. On top of that, because their finances can be precarious, they're going to be understandably very risk averse. They're not going to want to enter into any agreement, even if it looks good in the short term, that could leave them down the road with higher costs than commercial electricity bills, and therefore leave them in a worse position financially. They have very little room for maneuver, so they need to feel that whatever they enter into is definitely going to be good for them financially, both in the short term and the long term. Because there's been less market penetration of solar in the LMI community than in more well-to-do communities, they're probably less likely to know people who've installed solar. They haven't learned from those people's experience. They may not get recommendations of how to proceed. They may not easily get references to good solar installers. And they may not trust utilities and government officials because of their prior experiences. That may make them hesitant to believe information they receive in marketing from utility companies or from government agencies. So a lot of challenges here. What are the implications of those challenges? The first one is that we can't assume that there's going to be significant market penetration of the LMI community without special help. To make that possible, LMI people need special programs, special incentives, special marketing, and special outreach. All those things are necessary to make LMI solar work effectively. The programs need to be designed in ways that will ensure that they're going to be meaningful benefits for the LMI community and not put them at financial risk. What that means when we're evaluating an LMI solar program, whether it's successful, whether it makes sense, the best measure is not going to be the number of kilowatts of solar installed. The best measure is this program leaving the recipients and the participants in this program better off financially or worse off financially? For all these reasons, public budgets don't go as far when trying to serve this population. It doesn't lead to as many kilowatts installed as when setting up a program that's aimed at a more well-to-do audience. When thinking about the LMI audience, it's important not to think of it as one large undifferentiated mass. There's actually a large number of different market segments, and each one of those market segments needs a different strategy, different sorts of programs, and different sorts of incentives. It's very different trying to reach the homeowner market rather than the renter's market. And then even within the renters market, it's different trying to reach renters who pay for their own utilities as opposed to those renters whose utility costs are wrapped into their monthly rental payments. Compared to those who are in the upper half of the income scale, for the LMI audience, a higher percentage lives in multifamily housing, and it's very different trying to move forward with projects aimed at the multifamily housing market versus the single-family housing market. And then there's also a significant segment of the LMI audience that lives in mobile homes. That creates its own challenges. Reason for that is mobile homes may not have roofs that are strong enough to support solar, but the owner of the mobile home may not actually own the land, and that creates issues for how to set it up to make it possible to do either a pole-mounted or a ground-mounted PV system. There's also differences in the demographic characteristics of different components of the LMI audience. It's very different trying to do a program aimed at senior citizens on fixed income versus young families versus singles. And all those different market segments which aim at trying to help households with their residential electricity bills, that's different than trying to design a program aimed at helping community institutions like homeless shelters and neighborhood health centers with their electricity bills. Well, all this suggests that although there's a significant opportunity and there's a significant importance with trying to do LMI solar, it's quite challenging. But before I close, I want to suggest that it's not necessarily as bleak as it might seem at first glance. Although it's clear that there's been greater market penetration among those segments of the population in the upper half of the income scale, it's not like the LMI market isn't being reached at all. In California in 2015, for example, 28% of solar installations were in neighborhoods with average incomes from $40,000 to $55,000, and 6% of the installations were in incomes under $40,000. As that example shows, and as another example that was done with 4 different states show, we're making some progress. Things are better now than it was 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But in general, we tend to be dealing better with those folks who have moderate incomes, who are, say, in the 20 to 40% of the income scale, as opposed to those folks who are in the bottom 20% of the income scale. It's also reassuring to keep in mind that low income does not always mean bad credit. In general, homeowners tend to have decent credit regardless of their income. And the reason for that is owning a home is good for your credit score. What that means is there's a significant share, it's not the majority, but there's a significant share of the LMI audience that consists of homeowners with decent credit ratings. And if that market is targeted, that's a relatively easy segment of the LMI audience to reach out to. Well, that's an overview of the opportunities and challenges related to LMI solar. Let's turn to some questions.
Thank you, Warren. We have a couple of questions for you, and I just want to remind anyone that if you have any questions for the speakers, you can type them into the question box on the control panel on the side of your screen. The first question is, can you re-explain why it's an issue for LMI households seeking solar when they're required to pay 30% of income towards housing and utilities because they have a housing subsidy? Doesn't it just mean that they're able to get out of a housing subsidy program because of solar, or they just need less of a subsidy?
No, it's the issue is just getting solar. The amount they'll save there will not necessarily mean they don't need a subsidy at all. And if they are required to spend 30% of their money on rent plus utilities, the simple math of it is if the utility bill goes down, the rent goes up. For complicated reasons with HUD and the way it's structured in different locations, it doesn't always work exactly that way in each place. But anybody in the Solar Community Challenge that's looking to serve LMI customers who get housing subsidies should find out how it works in their particular location to make sure that they're not in a zero-sum game where they think they're helping people, but it's not actually leading to any financial improvement.
Thank you. And here's our next question. You mentioned the importance of limiting risks for LMI households that go solar. How can that be done?
Well, you have to look at each particular sub-market segment and each particular type of program. Let me just give you one example, and this is something that will be discussed later on in this course, in this webinar series, when we get to community solar. And that has to do with the fact if folks are locked into a community solar program for the long term and it's difficult for them to get out of it, that's a significant risk. So a program that involves community solar for LMI households should be designed in a way that it's easy to get out if the cost of that program ends up being higher than expected or something changes with the participant's personal situation that makes it advisable for them to drop out. They should be able to get out without penalties. That's just one example.
Okay, thank you. And here's another question. What about community institutions that serve LMI communities? Are there any special challenges in installing solar at those facilities?
Yes, there are really sort of two special challenges beyond the things I talked about earlier. The first has to do with those institutions tend to have sort of big agendas, limited budgets. They may not have the time and energy to put a lot of time into figuring out how to best do solar. So a program should be designed in a way that it gives them some assistance, makes it easy, and doesn't draw them away from their core mission too much. On top of that, these sorts of institutions are nonprofit organizations, so they can't take advantage of federal tax credits. So a program needs to be structured in a way that somebody's going to be able to take those tax credits and pass on some of the financial savings from the tax credits to the community institutions. The Connecticut Green Bank, for example, had a very effective program through their commercial PACE initiative that structures participation by nonprofits in a way that they're paired with a commercial entity that initially owns the system, takes the tax credit, and the community institution benefits through lower electricity rates.
Great, and we have one final question for Warren. How large do the energy savings need to be for the benefits to low-income customers to be meaningful?
Well, it really varies. You got to be thinking of a variety of different factors. If it's an easy to implement program, if it's a program that doesn't require a lot of time and energy on the part of the LMI household, if it's a program that has low risk, if it's a program that has low cost to government agencies or whatever community institution is promoting it, in that case, this energy savings don't need to be as great as if it's a program that's going to take a lot of effort for the LMI household to participate in, that's going to take a lot of public money, that's going to take a lot of time, or has some risk in it. In general, if you think about the average LMI household having electricity costs at a national level of maybe about $80 a month, something that saves them $10 or $15 a month is probably a program that's worth considering if it's easy for everybody involved. If you're doing something that's a more significant lift for both the sponsoring institution and for the LMI participants, then when I've spoken to folks in various housing agencies who work with LMI markets, they say if you can get and reduce their electricity expenses by close to 50%, then that's a program that will have a very meaningful impact on their household finances.
Thank you, Warren, for your excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended this webinar and participated in our Q&A. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to every question that was submitted. If you have follow-up questions, or if you'd like to schedule a consultation as part of our virtual office hours, please email me at diana@cleanegroup.org. We hope you'll check out the other 7 presentations in this webinar series. For more information about this webinar series, you can visit the web address on your screen. This web page includes links to webinar recordings, as well as links to register for our upcoming November 17th webinar. We hope to see you there.